On the island of Puerto Rico, you'll encounter rich history, culture, beautiful beaches, majestic mountains, all packed into one sunny Caribbean paradise. The United States Army Reserve in Puerto Rico makes its home on the island, on Fort Buchanan. The ties between the history of the base and the history of the U.S. Army in Puerto Rico dates back to the 19th century during the Spanish-American War. From Afghanistan to Poland to Kuwait and Korea, the Army Reserve in Puerto Rico is always ready to answer the call. With the deactivation of the 373rd Infantry Regiment in 1922, members of that unit became the first element of what was known back then as the Organized Reserve, evolving from an infantry brigade that participated in World War II to the largest command of the Army at the federal level in the Caribbean.
Historically, those first members of the Army Reserve in Puerto Rico were part of an active duty component unit that was created in preparation for World War I, which was the 94 Division, which was a division that was created. It was supposedly to be formed only by Puerto Rican soldiers, and it was composed of several infantry regiments, including the 373rd Infantry Regiment, which was the regiment that, after the inactivation of that division and their subordinate regiments, was allocated to the Army Reserve in Puerto Rico and stationed in San Juan. And they were the first members, the first formations of the Army Reserve on the island.
The patch depicts the famous Morro Castle in San Juan, Puerto Rico. The colors, red and gold, are associated with the Spanish heritage of the island.
The Garita patch was basically an active duty patch. It was a shoulder sleeve insignia, or patch like we call it, that was created for all the members of the U.S. Army in the Antilles and the Caribbean. And back in the early 40s, before the start of World War II, there were soldiers, all the active soldiers in Puerto Rico and reserve soldiers also. Anybody assigned to any type of unit of the Army in Puerto Rico wore the Garita patch.
Since then, reserve soldiers from Puerto Rico have fought in World War II, Persian Gulf, the former Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
The mission of the U.S. Army Reserve in Puerto Rico is to sustain readiness for mobilization in the event that there's a contingency or something that happens that requires reservists from the U.S. Army Reserve in Puerto Rico to be mobilized to support a combatant commander or a natural disaster in Puerto Rico to mitigate suffering and save lives. My vision for the First Mission Support Command is it's first and foremost a command climate that is anchored on dignity and respect, a command climate where our soldiers are empowered, where they have a voice, where our training events are all focused on building occupational skills, a vision in which family members, we take care of our family members. Also, an important component of the vision is improving relationships with state and federal agencies or elements in Puerto Rico, where we build productive, healthy relationships, especially with the Puerto Rico National Guard, which are important. It's an important relationship in the event of a natural disaster in Puerto Rico. And I feel blessed and very fortunate to have been chosen as the commander of the 1st MSC, especially when we're celebrating our 100th anniversary of U.S. Army Reserves.
The U.S. Army Reserve in Puerto Rico is a dedicated federal reserve force that is ready today and prepared to meet the challenges of tomorrow.
It's important for Army Reserve soldiers to train so we can keep our MOS proficiency skills up, so ultimately we can answer the nation's call.
Today's Army Reserve is made of thousands of soldiers. They perform in different fields, which including the logistics, transportation, information technology, communication, and they all, even though they have to train to be soldiers, they also need to be proficient in their mission essential task list, which are the sets of skills that determines the proficiency of the soldier in their specific field.
What is the role of the NCO in training our junior enlisted? So our responsibility is to mentor soldiers, period, and that's junior enlisted and junior officers. Another role we have also is it's extremely important for non-commissioned officers to be candid with commanders as far as all aspects of training, individual training, and especially collective training.
Non-commissioned officers, we are members of a time-honored corps, which is known as the backbone of the Army. We are advisors, communicators, mentors, and primarily trainers. We ensure mission accomplishment, and we also take care of the welfare of our soldiers. We are like the bridge line between the soldiers and the officers. We take ownership of the trust they have instilled upon us to bring honor to the Corps.
How does that improve readiness? So when we're subject matter experts in our field, our MOS, we're creating cohesive teams at the squad level and creating highly trained, physically fit soldiers, and that's what we're getting after at the 1st MSC.
Non-commissioned officers, we are constantly working towards readiness. Readiness is divided in 4 pillars: manning, equipment, training, and professional development, and is benchmarked against our ability to meet operational requirements. And for the Army Reserve, readiness is a top priority because in an increasingly volatile world, we must be ready to deploy anywhere in the world when needed.
Federal Reserve of the Army, Army Reserve units and its soldiers must be ready to mobilize, deploy, fight, and win as an integrated part of the Army team.
So Army Reserve soldiers are an invaluable asset. There was a time in history where the Army Reserve was considered to be a strategic reserve. And what that meant is that the active Army would deploy, set up operations, and then after a period of time, the Army Reserve would come in and either enhance that capability or start to replace some of those active duty units that have already been there for a long time. Now the Army Reserve is considered an operational reserve, and what that means is that the active Army needs us to do our role, and they're going to need us way earlier than that old model. So we may have units that the plan would call for us to be mobilized within a 45-day period, actually be able to deploy and do our job within a 45-day period. So overall, it's important to in the Army Reserve to be able to have those additional forces that we need. We can't afford as a nation to have a 2 million person active duty Army, but having that extra capability in case something happens that's significant, that's a threat to the nation, is important. So the Army Reserve is such a critical component of that.
While we fully acknowledge that our first responsibility is to leverage our unique capabilities to support the Army in winning the nation's wars, being strategically located in the Caribbean enables us to support humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations when requested by our allies.
We either are doing offensive operations, defensive operations, stability, or DISCA. What makes DISCA very unique is it's the mission that we do inside of the United States, including the CONUS part as well as all the territories of the United States. So it's the opportunity for the Department of Defense to support civil authorities, as DISCA, as you would suspect from the name, under a national disaster. So generally a catastrophic event in our case, the 1st MSC. We have urban search and rescue team, which can help immediately after an incident, rescue victims that may be isolated due to flooding or structural collapse, things of that nature. But as we're bringing more federal and state resources into the response, they need to be supported. They need a place to sleep. They need a place to, food to eat and water to drink. So we have field feeding teams, and we have a slew of logistics capabilities, water storage and distribution, petroleum distribution, transportation resources that can move supplies around the island. It's all coordinated by FEMA under their National Response Framework and National Incident Management System. So they're kind of the lead agency when it comes to responding to to disasters within the United States. And if they once the civil authorities have kind of maxed out their capacity to respond locally or at the state level, then FEMA could reach out to the Department of Defense and ask for their assistance, and then that's where the first MSC could come into play in Puerto Rico.
Today, with almost 5,000 citizen soldiers with professional specialties, Army Reserve soldiers receive the same training as active duty soldiers. The Army has also employed civilians since its beginning to work alongside soldiers in uniform, filling critical support roles in more than 500 career fields. With more than 330,000 employees, Army Civilian Corps is one of the largest, busiest, and most successful organizations within the Department of Defense.
The first civilian back then was Mr. Richard Peters. He was a lawyer who, when Congress established the Board of War, he was the first civilian hire employed by the Army. He became the secretary of the Board of War. So the Army civilians, they are part of the team, and they provide leadership, stability, and continuity to the operation during war. So they support and defend the Constitution, as well as the soldiers. They take the oath and live up to the Army values of loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service. In 2006, by executive order of the President, they established the Army Civilian Corps. And in 2019, they added the leadership role to the civilian workforce as they provide influence to the military leader. We have close to 330,000 civilians in the Army today working in the three compos: active duty, Compo 1, National Guard Compo 2, and in the Army Reserve Compo 3.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that her flag was still there. Oh, save the that Star-Spangled Banner, yeah.